Moving on to unpleasant news, the Communist Chinese government issued new warnings to the U.S. and the world this week regarding its stance on Taiwan. And Chinese e-commerce companies appear to be using spyware to help the CCP surveil American consumers. What are they looking for? And there's some new developments on the case of the incarcerated Hong Kong businessman and democracy advocate Jimmy Lai. Joining me to discuss all of it and much more, president of the Population Research Institute, author of The Bully of Asia, Stephen Mosher. Steve, thanks for being here. I want to start with Jimmy Lai. According to reports, a Hong Kong court has granted what is being called a partial victory to Lai and 6 others charged with participating in the banned 2019 protest against the Chinese government. The court tossed out 1 of 2 charges against the 7 men, finding they could not be held liable for organizing the protest. The court unanimously upheld the charge of participation, however. The AP released pictures of Lai in prison. We're going to put one up on the screen now. Steve, what are you hearing about this development?
Well, this is only part of a series of charges that have been brought against Jimmy Lai. Now, the most serious charge was brought against him in 2020 after the national security law was imposed by the Chinese Communist Party on Hong Kong, not through the locally elected legislature, which is now just a rubber stamp parliament, but imposed by the Chinese Communist Party itself. Jimmy Lai was arrested for violating the national security law by conspiring with foreign powers and so forth a few weeks later. And he's been in solitary confinement since then. They refused to let him out on bail. He's in a concrete cell, unair conditioned in the tropical heat in Hong Kong, 23 hours a day. He's only allowed out for an hour of exercise in a very small, area topped by barbed wire, about 16 by 30 feet. So he is being punished already, really for doing what I think every believing Catholic should do, and that is speak out for freedom of conscience, for freedom of religion, and for human rights in general.
Well, as you mentioned, he's in the middle of that 69-month sentence, allegedly for fraud stemming from what they call improper use of Apple Daily's office space, I guess, to foment democratic activities. Will Jimmy Lai ever see the outside of prison, do you think, Steve?
Well, I think he's quite clear on the fact that he's probably going to die in prison. He said back in an interview a couple of years ago, Jimmy did, sitting in his house with a picture of the Madonna and Child behind him, because he's a very faithful Catholic. He's a Catholic martyr of our time. He said that I fully expect to die in prison. He said the Chinese Communist Party wants to rule by fear. I refuse to be afraid. And if that means that I must spend my life in prison, the rest of my life in prison, so be it. You know, everyone should know that our Catholic faith, Raymond, as you know, is in direct and irreconcilable conflict with communism or any form of totalitarian government. In fact, the Catechism says that totalitarian states systematically falsify the truth, exercise political control of opinion through the media, manipulate defendants and witnesses at public trials, and imagine they can secure their tyranny by strangling and repressing everything they consider to be thought crimes. Now, Jimmy Lai knows that. You know that. I know that. Our listeners know that. The communists know that. China's dictator Xi Jinping certainly knows that. So there'll be no quarter granted to Jimmy Lai or the people of Hong Kong. Sadly, some people in the Vatican seem to not be reading their catechism of late.
Well, I urge all of our viewers, our listeners around the world to pray for Jimmy Lai, pray for his family. They certainly could profit from that. And as you said, he is the martyr, whether white or otherwise, in this time. Also, this week, China engaged in some saber-rattling, Steve, at the Moscow International Security Conference. The CCP's defense minister attended and announced a number of initiatives that China will expand military cooperation with Belarus and Iran, expand its international cooperation on arms control and what they call nuclear non-proliferation, and promote peace talks to resolve international conflicts in places like Ukraine. The minister said, quote, countries are increasingly interacting with each other in the global village, and it is inevitable that they encounter frictions here and there. What is important is to communicate openly and resolve differences. China has always advocated promoting mutual trust through dialogue, gathering similarities, and resolving differences and conflicts, whether in Afghanistan, Syria, the Korean Peninsula, Ukraine, or Iran on the nuclear issue. China is committed to promoting peace and negotiations and building more international consensus. It breaks my heart to even read that, Steve. What is their end game here? No mention of cooperation with the U.S., and they appear to be taking it upon themselves to act as the lone global superpower here.
Yeah, well, let's look beyond the smoke and mirrors at the reality of what's happening. The reality is that we have fairly credible evidence that China is supplying Russia with military equipment and replacement parts for its weapons while it continues to attack Ukraine. So that's number one. They're not working for peace in Ukraine. They're working for the victory of their newfound ally, Russia. As far as expanding cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation, China is engaging in the fastest and I think most worrisome buildup of its nuclear arsenal in history. They for years have claimed to be just have a few hundred nuclear weapons. They are going now for thousands. So that any treaty that doesn't include Russia, that's just between the United States and Russia, any treaty that does not include China, of course, will be useless because China is building up a first strike nuclear arsenal. As far as peace, the saber rattling really has been continual since the founding of the People's Republic of China. They invaded Tibet in 1959. They took over eastern Turkestan, Xinjiang, a few years before that. They invaded Vietnam in 1979. They have taken over the South China Sea in the last 20 years, and they are now encircling Taiwan every day with fighters and bombers and ships from the People's Liberation Army Navy. Saber rattling, yes, on a daily basis, and even threatening Japan, saying that the islands, it's not just the Senkaku Islands, but Okinawa was once a tributary state of China and should be again. That's a direct threat to Japan's sovereignty, and it doesn't stop there. Communism is inherently expansionist. It is a cancer that keeps spreading. And so it will spread beyond Taiwan if they take Taiwan, beyond the South China Sea to parts closer to the United States.
It's good that you mentioned that, Steve. China's defense minister also issued a warning to the international community and implicitly the United States that all are playing with fire with Taiwan in order to, quote, contain China would be met with failure, he said. What is their game here? How much longer before China moves against Taiwan, do you think?
Well, we understand that the communist dictator Xi Jinping has set a timeline for the invasion and that the invasion is supposed to occur by 2026. Now, I think that he desperately wants to cement his legacy as the most important and fiercest ruler of China since Mao Zedong himself by actually taking Taiwan. So I do not think this is an idle threat. I think that the fact that we have promised hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons to Taiwan, but have now postponed the delivery of those weapons for 2 or 3 years is a grave error. Weakness invites aggression. And right now, we need to bolster Taiwan's defenses to the maximum extent so that strength deters the possible aggression from China. If they know an invading fleet will be sunk in the Taiwan Straits, they will not attempt an invasion. Otherwise, I believe, Raymond, they will go ahead.
Taiwan's Vice President William Lai visited the U.S. this week, almost got no coverage. He said, if Taiwan is safe, the world is safe. If the Taiwan Strait is peaceful, the world is peaceful. Now, China, naturally, has denounced Lai as a separatist troublemaker. VP Lai is a favorite to become the next president of Taiwan. What do you know about him? Can he be counted on to resist China's advance? And does he have U.S. support?
Well, those are all very, very interesting questions. The first is, can he be counted on to protect Taiwan from China? Yes. He is a member of what was once known as the Independence Party, the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan, and they are absolutely committed to retaining Taiwan's de facto independence. As to whether we would defend Taiwan if it were attacked, I'm hoping that won't be necessary by building up Taiwan's own defenses. But should it come to that, it all depends on who is in the Oval Office. We have heard conflicting signals, uncertain trumpets from the Biden administration, with the president saying one thing and his lower ranking officials saying another. So it's difficult to know who's in charge and what our policy is towards Taiwan right now. But we need to keep Taiwan free, not just for the sake of the 24 million people on Taiwan who enjoy a free market economy, who enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, free elections. They have one coming up, but also because it is an important part of the defense perimeter around China, containing China, that stretches from South Korea through Japan, through Taiwan, down to the Philippines, down to Indonesia, Vietnam, and Australia and New Zealand. If you lose Taiwan, the People's Liberation Army Navy of Communist China has direct access to the open ocean, the open waters of the Pacific, and the next stop is Guam and then Hawaii. So keeping Taiwan as part of that defensive perimeter is very important to our own national security.
Yeah. Another story we've been following, Steve, is China's e-commerce apps. Apparently used by American and international shoppers. Here's the problem. Shopping apps with ultra-low prices like Temu seem to be cooperating with the CCP by mining data from U.S. consumers. Steve, tell us what's going on here. What is the CCP using that data for?
Well, first of all, Raymond, there are no private companies in China. Every company in China is either owned by, run by, or influenced by, behind the scenes by the Chinese Communist Party, which has a 2017 intelligence law saying that every company in China must turn over data important to national security to the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence services. So when you see a China app, regardless of what the company purports to be, it is a data mining operation. If you download a China app, it will ransack the data on your phone, your photographs, your contacts, and you buy anything, it takes your financial information. It all goes into supercomputers in China, where they are building up a database for everyone, I think, not just in China, but in wider parts of the world and in the United States. Now, I don't want to be doing business with the Chinese Communist Party, so I won't buy anything from an app like Temu, because they're all goods produced in China. And again, no private companies in China, so you're doing business with China. I won't buy anything made in China because the products themselves are often unsafe. They contain, for example, high levels of lead or heavy metals. And I won't buy products in China because they're often made by slave labor. Anything made out of cotton from China is coming from Xinjiang, the Uyghur territory, where they are being treated as literal slaves working in the cotton plantation, planting and picking cotton. And then the workers in the factories on the East Coast, the export factories, are not much better off. 4 cents a garment, producing 500 garments a day is one of the assignments that garment workers have in China. That's 12, 13 hours a day, day after day, 30 days a month. That's sweat labor. That's the sweatshop that makes the 18th century British sweatshops look like paradise in comparison.
Steve, what other apps should people be concerned about? I mean, beyond Temu, China continues to meddle and interfere with social media networks. I mean, we've certainly heard reports about TikTok and how they, as you mentioned, ransack people's private information.
Well, and TikTok is even worse than that, because TikTok in the United States and in Europe is a very different TikTok than you see in China. In China, the social media is very carefully controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, not just to put the party in a good light, but to make sure that children in China do not spend too much time on social media. There are limits on the number of hours they can be on, to make sure they don't see anything that might be harmful to them, such as pornography, which is banned in China. And so if you go on the TikTok in China, you don't see social media influencers, men who pretend to be women. But that is promoted, not just allowed, but promoted on TikTok in the United States. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think the answer is they're trying to destroy the moral fiber of our country. They're trying to weaken the family. They're trying to corrupt small children. They're doing anything they can, really, to weaken the United States, because China's plan is called unrestricted warfare. And they are literally at war with us across all domains, from cyberspace to outer space, in order to weaken and replace us as the dominant power on the planet. And it's really no holds barred. And China has a 100-year plan ending in 2049, by which time it intends to be the dominant power on the planet. And they are methodically pursuing that plan year by year, app by app, social media post by social media post.
Also in headlines this week, Steve, the forced repatriation of North Korean refugees from China back to North Korea, where they now face torture and death. Human rights groups have criticized the UN for what were calling unacceptable silence on the issue. Now the UN is expressing grave concern over the matter. The Chinese government labels North Koreans as illegal economic migrants and forcibly repatriates them as a matter of routine. Why the initial silence from the UN? Seems like another case of giving China a pass when it comes to human rights.
Yes, except that for the last 30 years, the Chinese Communist Party has made a concerted effort to place its officials in junior and increasingly senior positions within the UN structure. It is a highly organized, well-funded project, and has resulted in a huge presence of the Chinese Communist Party within UN organizations, and effectively defanging them when it comes to human rights issues. I mean, you've got a Human Rights Council at the UN, which has states like one of the worst violators of human rights in the world serve on the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, and for the most part, they do China's bidding. So you will get no criticism of China from UN agencies. But the other thing this tells you is the Chinese economy is in very, very bad shape, because in years past, they would have welcomed the North Koreans who came across the border, who went to work in Chinese factories.
Right.
Now there aren't enough jobs for the Chinese people themselves. The youth unemployment rate is at 25-30%. And so they're now arresting these economic migrants and sending them back across the border to North Korea. But defecting, going across the border illegally, is a traitorous act to North Korean dictators. And these people will be sent immediately to prison and will probably not survive the experience.
Steve, that's a great segue to this important question. Demographers say that China's fertility rate dropped to a new low in 2022, according to China Population and Development Research Center, down to 1.09 children per family. Now, this is the lowest rate among countries with more than 100 million people. Hong Kong's Family Planning Association says the number of couples without children has reached alarming levels, over 43%. Steve, is a demographic nightmare on the horizon for China?
Oh, absolutely. China's dying. And it's dying at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, which, of course, embarked on a one-child policy on the misguided understanding that people were a burden, babies were a blessing, and not a blessing, but a burden. And over the last 40 years, they have eliminated, by forced abortion mostly, 400 million children from their population. Now, those children today would have grown up, the children born in the 80s and 90s would have grown up to be productive citizens, but they're gone. Half of the last two generations of Chinese were killed in utero or shortly after birth. And now the Chinese Communist Party is waking up to the consequences. China has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, as you mentioned, but those are official figures, Raymond. I don't trust any official figures coming out of China. I think the real numbers in China are closer to the numbers out of Hong Kong. Less than one child per woman over her reproductive lifetime. You can still, right now, trust the numbers out of Hong Kong more than you can trust the numbers out of China. So I believe the true birth rate in China, because of the economic downturn, because so many little girls were killed by sex-selective abortion and female infanticide, because marriage rates are way down, the real birth rate in China is below 1 and falling. It may stabilize at 0.8 children per woman over their reproductive lifetime, but that's a recipe for demographic suicide. You're losing more than half your population each generation at that rate. And if that rate continues, Raymond, by the year 2080, there will be more Americans than there are Chinese.
And what happens economically? What are the economic consequences? We always hear, oh, the economy's about to tank. I just read a story about this, and it's tied to the demography. Do you buy those stories?
Oh, I think China has an economic nightmare on its hands for several reasons. One is demographic, right? You killed off 400 million of the most productive, enterprising people on the planet, and you think you're better off? No. You crippled your economic growth for the foreseeable future. Secondly, Americans have woken up to the China threat. 85% of Americans see China as a threat. Most Europeans are following close behind. The amount of goods that we're buying from China is now at a 20-year low. It is falling into the cellar. And guess what? The only sector of the Chinese economy that really works, that produces a profit, is the export sector. If they lose that sector of the economy, the rest of the economy is white elephants, state-owned enterprises. They lose money. They hemorrhage red ink. They bleed red ink year after year. If they lose the export sector, which they're in danger of doing, then the economy will tank. Finally, you've got this bubble in the housing market in China. 60% of the wealth of China is in apartment buildings and retail complexes. The bottom is falling out of that market. And when the collapse comes, and it'll come more suddenly than anyone imagines, it will be disastrous for the Chinese economy. Now, that doesn't mean that we're out of the woods as far as the China threat is concerned. I think the coming collapse of China actually makes China more dangerous rather than less dangerous, at least over the short term.
Yeah. Steve, since you were last here, Pope Francis accepted China's pick for the Bishop of Shanghai, Joseph Shenbin. Francis also elevated the Bishop of Hong Kong, Stephen Chow, to Cardinal. Now, Chow is the successor of Cardinal Joseph Zen, been here so many times, the tireless advocate for religious freedom in China. Your thoughts on these, the only nice way to call them is capitulations to the CCP and the current state of this China-Vatican pact, which still remains a secret agreement.
Yes, it does, surprisingly, even though it's now I think a dead letter, clearly. I have to say that Cardinal Zen, whom you just mentioned, and Jimmy Lai are holy warriors. They need our prayers. They're undergoing tremendous trials for speaking out on behalf of the God-given rights of the people of China and Hong Kong. As far as Cardinal Joe, I hope that things work out well. I do know that he's been at democracy protests in the past. I do know that he's been at the memorial ceremonies, candlelighting ceremonies for the victims of the Tiananmen massacre. So I'm hoping that he stays strong. As far as the new Bishop of Shanghai, that was a fait accompli by the Chinese Communist Party against the Vatican. They didn't consult with the Vatican. They simply moved this bishop into that post. And after temporizing for 3 months, the Vatican was finally, I think, had its hand forced and accepted him as the legitimate bishop of Shanghai. So that tells you all you need to know about the Sino-Vatican agreement, which was supposed to be an agreement for the two sides to cooperate on the appointment of bishops. Obviously, the China side is not cooperating. It is simply imposing bishops on the Vatican, and the Vatican now is simply being forced to accept them.
Stephen Mosher, we will leave it there. As always, the current edition of Bully of Asia by Stephen is available at bookstores everywhere. Stephen, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Raymond.